Hi everyone, welcome to the Lancaster University Marketing Department's Taster Lecture. My name is Sandra Awanes, and I'm going to give you a flavor of how virtual marketing classroom looks like in our department. So just a little bit about myself before we start. I'm a lecturer in international marketing here, and I joined Lancaster University in 2014. Before joining Lancaster, I did a PhD in business and management at the University of Manchester, and then I was a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for International Marketing Management in Vienna, in Austria. In fact, I'm still an external lecturer there, and I've been taking on this role since 2013. My teaching and research specialties are really in three main areas. The first area is global marketing management, which is about looking at marketing opportunities and challenges faced by international marketers working in multinational corporations. The second area of my interest is consumer culture. So I teach and publish in research that looks at cultural differences across consumers from different countries and how generally culture shapes people's values and buying behavior. And finally, marketing in emerging market is another area of study that I'm involved in. I'm originally from Indonesia, so this is a topic that's close to my heart. So in today's taster session, I'm going to be sharing with you a session on marketing in emerging markets. Hopefully you'll get a sense and flavor of what contemporary issues we tend to look at in this type of subject. So here are the key points that I'm going to be covering in this session. I'll start with a brief introduction to the marketing department at Lancaster and what it means to study with us. Next, I'll move on to the taster session, which will be titled Marketing in Emerging Market, as I've mentioned. And within this session, we'll be looking at exactly what is an emerging market and what is it not. We'll then do a comparison between emerging and other type of market economies, specifically more developed and developing markets. We'll then zoom into the specific characteristics of emerging markets and what make them unique, and exactly what that uniqueness mean to marketing professionals who are looking to gain a foothold in emerging markets. Okay, let me start by giving you a quick tour around the marketing department at Lancaster University and what makes our students and graduates so highly sought after in this competitive job market. So one of the things that we're extremely proud of is our history. We're the longest established marketing department in the country. We were founded in 1964, and we even had the first professor of marketing outside the US in the name of Professor Ray Lawrence in 1965. So studying with us means that you'll be studying at a place with a unique intellectual heritage. We've been awarded as the International University of the Year 2020 by the Times and the Sunday Times. So this accolade speaks really to the quality of the experience that we give our students during and after their studies with us. We're also a research-focused university. But that doesn't mean that we only focus on research. In fact, we've received the highest teaching accolades with our TEF Gold Award. And that means that all of our teaching is research informed and they are delivered by the leading marketing academics and professionals in the field. Our curriculum places a lot of emphasis on both theory and practice. And real-world experience is actually an essential element of our degree schemes. For example, our marketing degrees have a specific module called Marketing Research Consultancy, where you get to work with real-life clients to solve real-world marketing problems. So it's a great opportunity for our students to apply theories into practice and, of course, to build their CV and employability. Our programs also offer flexibility for you to tailor your university experiences according to your interests. So, for example, you can combine your marketing majors with minors in languages and media studies if those are the kind of subjects that you are interested in. But of course, they are subject to timetabling availability, and you have to bear in mind that there are prerequisites that you might have to meet in order to register some of these minor modules. Some of our degrees also have study abroad and placement years built into the curriculum. However, again, bear in mind that they are extremely competitive programs, so we can't always guarantee places, but we always do our best to allocate people into the programs that they're interested in. We've recently been ranked third in the country in the UK by the Complete University Guide 2020 in terms of graduate prospect. And that means 90% of our graduates are either employed or have joined a postgraduate degree after the successful completion of their studies. So all in all, our graduates have an excellent employability track record. So here is a list of the 7 marketing degree programs that we offer at Lancaster University. Each of the degree scheme offers unique learning experiences that are really tailored to the different kinds of marketing activities that you're interested in. So our flagship marketing degree scheme is a 3-year program, which is an all-rounder degree scheme that suits those of you who are interested in taking on the different varieties of marketing activities out there, like branding or marketing management. Advertising and marketing, that's another 3-year program that suits those of you who are interested in the more communicative and advertising sides of marketing, potentially looking to work with marketing agencies to develop effective advertisements and commercials. Marketing management, this is a 4-year program with a placement year built into the curriculum of your study. You will be going out to do your placement in your 3rd year, and this will suit those of you who are interested in the leadership and corporate sides of marketing. Marketing study abroad and marketing management study abroad. So these are the study abroad variants of the marketing and marketing management degree programs that I've mentioned earlier. These programs mean that you'll be spending the 2nd year of your study in one of our partners abroad, either in North America, Australasia, or Europe. And this means that you will get the international experience and will benefit those of you looking to work in international marketing or in a multinational corporation. Marketing with Psychology, that's another 3-year program that is delivered jointly with the psychology department in Lancaster University. So you would be taking both marketing and psychology-led modules throughout your academic study. And this is a route that is really popular for those students who are interested in marketing research. And finally, marketing and design. That's a 3-year program that is also delivered by the design department and will suit those of you who are interested in design management. But remember, these are flexible categories. Any marketing degrees outlined here can lead to any of the careers that I mentioned. Let's now move on to the taster session on marketing in emerging markets. This is a topic that runs in our final year undergraduate course called Global Marketing Management. So hopefully this taster will give you a flavor of the kind of subject we cover at this level. Now, the word emerging market tends to be thrown around very often in the news, in company reports, and certainly in academic articles. But the meaning behind the term isn't always clear. Now, ask yourself, what do you think is an emerging market? Well, your answer to this question may be different from other people viewing this video, depending on whose perspective you are taking. So for example, those of you who are taking on the hats of households or consumers, You might see emerging markets simply as a source of cheap consumer goods. So a lot of emerging market countries out there tend to be seen as the manufacturing centers of the world. If you're putting on the hats of multinational companies, emerging markets tend to be seen as the next source of growth amid stagnation and financial crisis in the more developed economy. For others, and for media in particular, unfortunately, the term emerging market isn't always seen in a positive light because it's often seen as the place where manufacturing, technical, and consumer service jobs even are increasingly being outsourced to these countries. So there is sometimes an underlying competitive tone there when media are talking about emerging markets. But regardless of whether people's views of emerging markets are positive or negative, rightly or wrongly, emerging market is undoubtedly an important part of the global market and the global economy. So in the next set of slides, we're going to be looking at why this is exactly the case a little more closely. So at the most fundamental level, the growing importance of emerging markets is really caused by the saturation of domestic markets in many developed parts of the world. Essentially, this has forced many companies based in those countries to look for marketing opportunities beyond their national borders. And this graph here in this slide basically illustrates the effect of the nature of saturated markets in many developed markets. And as you can see, since the financial crisis in 2009, consumer confidence in those markets has sort of dipped massively, even after the period of the financial crisis. And it has been very difficult for the consumer confidence level to return to the pre-financial crisis levels. On the other hand, consumer confidence in emerging markets are thriving. The economic and population growth in those countries also gave multinationals coming from developed markets the additional incentives to venture abroad. So really, if you look at it, the future growth of developed markets multinationals seem to be more destined to come from emerging markets than from within their national borders. And relative to the more advanced economies and markets, emerging markets are actually demonstrating GDP growth despite the current pandemic that we're unfortunately still experiencing today. As you can see here from this slide, the latest data of the world's economic activity in terms of real GDP growth shows that emerging and developing economies are on average only contracting by about 1%. On the other hand, the more advanced economies are contracting by about 6.1%. So all in all, the world's GDP growth at the moment is at minus 3%. But if you look at the individual countries, you can certainly see that certain countries remain to be in a more or less healthy economic position, with some of them, pictured here in green, which means that they are, experiencing positive growth. And if you look at these countries, they are more certainly part of the emerging and developing market categories, such as China, Indonesia, India, Kenya, and quite a few other countries in African continent. Another significance of emerging market is the creation of new middle-class consumers coming from those parts of the world who are becoming large-scale first-time buyers in the world economy. So as you can see here from this slide, this is a data taken from the World Bank back in 2010, but it shows the forecasted growth of emerging markets, new middle class, well into 2030. So this is still a very current sort of analysis that we can use today. And it shows a significant increase of middle class consumers from 2014 to about 2030 by about triple the size of what it was in 2012. So what we're going to be experiencing in the world economy is that less people are going to be in what we call the bottom of the pyramid segments of the consumer. So those people who are essentially living in poverty, they're coming out of poverty, and with their increasing affluence, they are increasingly able to buy new products that they haven't been able to afford previously. So things like air conditioning or heater if you are living in the colder parts of the world, fridges, the kinds of necessities that we tend to often take for granted, but are exactly, the kind of purchases that signify middle class consumption. So this is going to be a significant, moment in history for multinationals targeting new middle class consumers in emerging markets, simply because there are so much potential commercial growth that are going to happen in this segment. Another significant and interesting thing about emerging market is the global rise of multinational companies coming from emerging markets. So reports say that about a third of Fortune Global 500 companies are coming from E20 countries, which is essentially the largest emerging market economies in the world. So that's quite a big proportion of what is essentially the wealthiest companies in the world. And marketers coming from emerging markets are actually very good at expanding globally, and particularly expanding into other emerging markets like other countries in Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, and Middle East. But emerging multinational companies are also becoming major global competitors in developed markets, but they tend to become, I guess, global player through acquisitions rather than organic growth. So just to give you a few examples of emerging multinational companies, some of these you may be familiar with already, and others may seem a bit of a surprise for you. So the first example is Grupo Modelo. As the logo shows, it's a brewery based in Mexico. And what perhaps many of you are not familiar with is that this is now a company that has been acquired by the largest brewery in the world, AB InBev, but they're very well known for producing some of the largest beer brands in the world, such as Budweiser, Bud Light, and more importantly, Corona. But they also import the Chinese Tsingtao and Danish Carlsberg. So this is a very significant player in the beer brewery market. Another example is Lenovo. So Lenovo is a Chinese company who specializes in computing. Back in 1997, it acquired the IBM arm of personal computers, and it has completely changed the name of the computers, but I think it sort of retains the consumer base, which is very good for the company. Another example is América Móvil. This is a telecommunication company based in South America, and although this may not necessarily be the most well-known telecommunication brand in the world, the owner of the company, which is Carlos Slim, was actually the richest person in the world from 2011 to 2013. So if you can imagine, he was even wealthier than Bill Gates. So this has been a very sort of a successful venture that comes from emerging markets, certainly. Another example is Alibaba. So this is a B2B company. Many of you might know that it's based in China. It's, of course, a very successful example of a multinational company coming from an emerging market. LG Electronics is a South Korean multinational company headquartered in Seoul. Again, it's a very sort of well-known multinational coming from an emerging market, and so is its competitor, Samsung. And both LG and Samsung are what we call chaebol. So chaebol is a family-run conglomerate in South Korea, and conglomerates tend to have very strong grip in many of the industries in emerging markets, particularly in South Korea, and it has quite a lot of influences and powers beyond their businesses. So, for example, they tend to have quite a lot of powers in political spheres and lobbying sort of spheres as well. Another example is Tata Group, another conglomerate that comes from India this time. And what's probably significant about Tata is that it's actually owns some of the, UK's largest brands, actually quite British essential brands like Land Rover, Jaguar, and Tetley Tea. So if you speak to any British person and you speak about some of these brands, I think you'll find that many of British people are quite sad to see some of these brands go to another sort of acquisitions. Another example, Tencent, a multinational, a born global sort of multinational coming from China. And Tencent is probably most well known amongst the young people out there for their ownership of game developing companies such as Blizzard, which produces World of Warcraft and Hearthstone. Which are obviously very popular games out there at the moment. Another important thing about emerging markets is that they tend to inspire frugal innovation. So frugal innovation is all about providing better solutions for more people by using fewer resources. And it has been practiced as a system by companies which are coming from emerging markets like India and China, which are, which tend to deal with complex and resource constrained sort of environments. So frugal innovation has now been adopted widely, but it's still being pioneered by emerging markets. So just to give you a couple of examples of frugal innovations, the first one is Tata Nano. We've already mentioned Tata earlier, and one of Tata's most successful sort of industry that it's participating in is automobile manufacturing. And they produced Tata Nano, and it has come to become known as the world's cheapest car, which only retailed at about $3,000. And part of the reason why it was so cheap was because the manufacturing used sort of less resources without compromising on quality. So for example, as you can see here, well, actually you can't really see here from this picture, but there's only one wing mirror in Tata Nano cars. And instead of using 4 screws to attach one part to another, they only use 3. So essentially they try to constrain all of the resources that they use in producing a car so that it can be more affordable for more people. Another example that I'd like to show here, it doesn't come actually from emerging markets, but this is inspired by the frugal innovation system coming from emerging market, and that is Raspberry Pi. So many of you may be familiar with it, but this is a British invention, which is essentially a very small computer about the size of a credit card, and it's really good because it basically can be used easily by people who are learning how to code, especially primary school children, and it can be easily amended to suit different purposes. So for example, it can be used as a simple computer or a weather forecasting system, and many other examples. But the idea is that it's a very simple to use, very cheap sort of innovation, which means that more people can afford it and more people are able to sort of learn how to code, learn how to use the internal systems of computing and affordably. Okay. So now that we've come to understand why emerging markets are important, let's look at some of the definitions relating to emerging, developing, and developed markets. So according to research, there are three types of market economies. Developing economies are countries that have achieved substantial industrialization, modernization, improved living standards, and growth. Emerging economies is basically a subset of developing economies that are in transition to becoming developed markets because of their especially rapid growth rate and industrialization. And finally, advanced economies are post-industrial countries which are characterized by high per capita income, highly competitive industries, and well-developed commercial infrastructures. So the fact that there are three main types of world of market economies means that there must be a system that decides whether a country is considered developing, emerging, or advanced economies. So let's take a look at who actually decides those sort of categorization. So who decides whether a market is developing, emerging, or advanced? The answer to this question is mainly the stock market. So the financial stock market is the ones who decides on the market categorization for investment purposes. So there are two main institutions that decide the categorization of world economies. The first one is FTSE Russell, and FTSE Russell is a leading global index provider that obviously create and manage a wide range of indexes. They do quite a lot of data and analytic solutions for their investors. And as you can see here, from the latest categorization of world markets, according to FTSE Russell, they divide countries into developed, advanced, emerging, secondary emerging, and frontier. So frontier markets are essentially developing countries. There are countries which are more developed than the least developing countries out there, but too small to be generally considered an emerging markets. So as you can see here, they've categorized quite a lot of countries into those categories, and some of the categorization actually changed year on year. So for example, Poland was promoted to a developed market status quite recently, whereas Kuwait was promoted to a secondary emerging market status. Another institution that determines the categorizations of world markets is MSCI. So that's Morgan Stanley Capital International. So it works in a very similar way as FTSE Russell. So it's a US-based investment research firm, and it provides also information about indexes relevant to investment banks. So according to MSCI, again, there are year-on-year differences in terms of different countries' categorization in their classification. So Saudi Arabia and Argentina, for example, has recently been promoted to an emerging market status. On the other hand, there's also an example of downgrading. So Greece was downgraded from developed to emerging market back in 2013 when it faced significant financial crisis in their domestic markets. It's also worth noting that the definition of emerging markets that we discussed earlier doesn't necessarily refer to particular countries or certain geographical areas. This definition implies every market. So certain markets have a degree of emergingness involved because they are relatively new, they are still developing, but they're not developed in a sense that there's not perhaps perhaps proper regulation that ensures safe usage of the products or services. It hasn't been around for long enough that people are completely knowledgeable about the products or services in order to make informed decisions about them. So it's still emerging, in the sense that there's still more development that needs to be done to those types of industries. And there are certainly a non-geographical emerging markets out there. So if we talk about emerging industries, certainly e-cigarette is a really good example of that. It's a growing market simply because it's a healthier alternative to cigarettes, which we know is quite harmful for people's health. Medical marijuana is another very good example. So a lot of countries have begun to legalize marijuana even for a personal use. Perhaps not the Netherlands, but still this is considered a growing sort of industries in many parts of the world. And emerging markets even exist in the labor market. So in the UK, we have what we call a 0-hour contract, which means that people who are employed within this type of employment agreement, they don't necessarily have to work every day. Also, a friend of mine works with a 0-hour contract at Manchester United, right? So he gets a call from the employer almost every week saying, do you want to work at this time and that time? And because he is also a student, and he has to retain a degree of flexibility, he can sort of say no to some of the shifts that were being offered to him. So this is what 0-hour contract is. So it is popular because it means that employees can more and more students, for example, can become employees flexibly. But for other people who depend on monthly income, a stable income, this is not necessarily good news for them, because employers tend to adopt 0-hour contract to lower costs in general. So now that we've come to understand what an emerging market is, let's now zoom in into the unique characteristics of emerging markets. So what makes an emerging market? According to research, most emerging markets are highly heterogeneous. They tend to be highly local, and governed by faith-based socio-political institutions in which public policy really matter. They suffer from inadequate infrastructure and chronic shortage of resources. Most of the competition also comes from unbranded products and services, and consumption is more of a make versus buy decision and less about what brand to buy. So I'd like now to zoom in specifically into one of the characteristics, market heterogeneity, and I'd like to discuss with you what this actually means for businesses trying to enter an emerging market. So what is market heterogeneity? Market heterogeneity basically speaks to the amount of differences that takes place within a country's marketplace. An emerging market tend to be highly heterogeneous in nature, which means that it tends to have large variance across all products and services that are being offered, the local versus global nature of the market. So the market essentially tends to be quite fragmented in nature, and as a result, it can be very difficult for businesses trying to enter an emerging market to gauge which part or which aspect of the marketplace they should target. And part of this heterogeneity of emerging market is driven by what they call the haves and the have-nots. So this is essentially the difference between the rich and the poor. About 40 to 50% of consumers coming from emerging emerging markets are what they call consumers at the bottom of the pyramids. So these are consumers who are essentially living in poverty. They are earning at about $2 per day, so they have very little means to afford basic necessities. And the level of heterogeneity in emerging market is also driven by the diversity between urban and rural households. Let's take a look at some of the pictures, images that I think really sort of illustrate some of these diversity and heterogeneity in emerging markets. The first picture that I'm wanting to show you here is almost like a visible poverty line, which you can see in many emerging markets capital cities, including my hometown in Jakarta in Indonesia. So this picture here is actually from Brazil. Brazil has received quite a lot of attention back in 2018 when it participated in the Olympics and World Cup, and there's been quite a lot of negative media attention because people come to realize, the amount of favela or the urban slums that are happening inside its major cities. And this is not an unfamiliar sight in many other emerging market cities, as I've mentioned. If you ever visit my country, my capital city's country, in Jakarta, you'll see very similar images as well, where there are quite a lot of skyscrapers, at in the background, and at the same time, within within a kilometer or two, you'll see quite a lot of urban slums, and so it shows the big divide between the rich and the poor within the big cities and emerging markets. And here is another set of pictures that shows the level of inequality in emerging markets. On one hand, you'll get quite a lot of wealthy people living in one side of the city. And this image here on the right hand side, it's the marine in Cape Town, and it really shows the top 1% and how they live in such a beautiful city. But not too far from this location, you will also see quite a lot of people struggling with affording daily necessities, even things like drinkable water and sanitation products. So it really shows us a divide between the rich and the poor in emerging markets, and this is again a very sort of familiar image that you will see in many other emerging market cities out there. But of course, heterogeneity is not just about the division between the rich and poor, even though if it's, as I said, it's quite prominent. There are also differences and divide between authenticity and counterfeit. For example, in China, there's quite a lot of pride in the national culture. So an example here that I've got is an image of the Chinese New Year, and this is a traditional celebration, but it's also an expression of authenticity. So people do pride themselves in their traditional values, but at the same time, there's also quite a lot of appreciation for counterfeits. So, for example, this image here shows how people have copied images from essentially the Times, and the design is very similar, and there's not much regard for I guess giving credits to originality in that sense. So there seems to be a tension here between the value for authenticity and counterfeit. There's also a divide between modern and traditional. So a set of examples here are images coming from the UAE, where you will see quite traditional marketplaces in, even in the biggest cities, in emerging markets, as I mentioned. But there's also, values for modernity. So pictured here is Dubai Mall, which is the largest in the world. Great shopping experience. And again, they're not too far, located from each other, which means that people really do value both modern and traditional sort of marketplaces. So, what does emerging markets heterogeneity means for international marketing? What does it mean for businesses wanting to set foot on emerging markets and target the various and diverse group of consumers there? Well, essentially, it creates more of a challenge than opportunities for businesses. So, the large level of heterogeneity in emerging markets means that it creates that what we call standardization versus localization dilemma for international marketing. So just brief introduction to some of these terms. Localization essentially is a strategy that marketers tend to adopt in order to meet diverse customer preferences. So they do that by segmenting the market and essentially target a segment of the market with a very specific product. Um, but what it tend to mean in emerging markets is that, because of marketplace heterogeneity, marketers are faced with maybe hundreds or thousands of market segments that they have to target. And this is simply not good business sense to target all of these market segments. And in order for you to do that, you have to have very complex operational sort of a system, and it may not necessarily result in profit because you're basically fragmenting the markets, and you might have internal competition within the brand as well. So thin profit margin is going to be the likely outcome of localization in emerging markets where there are quite a large number of heterogeneity within it. Standardization is another strategy, which basically means that marketers reduce varieties and sort of aggregate demands of a market in order to achieve scale efficiency. And this is actually a better strategy for marketers operating in a very heterogeneous market, like an emerging market, because it means that they can target a large number of population with maybe one or two products that sort of represents the interest of the nation, if you like. Now let's try and apply theory into practice, right? Now that we've looked at the definition of localization and standardization, you might want to think about what it actually means in terms of your experience. So you might straight away think of a brand and company that employs localization strategy and another brand that employs standardization strategy. So give yourself a bit of time, maybe pause this video and think about some of the examples a little more closely. So now that you've given yourself some time, you might straight away be thinking of brands, multinational brands like KFC, McDonald's, or Apple Computer as typical companies that adopt standardization strategy. This is because they basically use the same products across their operations worldwide. But of course, there are actually minor differences, right? KFC and McDonald's might have the same standard menus in different countries, but there are minor variations. So in Indonesia, for example, the KFC meals, when they always come with rice and soup instead of rice, like they do here in the UK, and that's because rice and soup are staple food in my country. And likewise, Apple products will have minor variations in pricing and variations in the shape of the power sockets, because this is a different requirement for different countries. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a company that adopts largely standardization strategy will ignore localization strategy. What's more likely is that they tend to adopt both. So the second implication on market heterogeneity in emerging market is that offering products and services with high affordability and accessibility is really more important as a strategy than offering superior products with exclusive access. So just to give you a couple of examples of companies that have managed to tap into the affordability and flexibility offerings in emerging markets, the first one on the left is Unilever, which is the market leader for fast-moving consumer goods in many emerging markets. Unilever has been successful in emerging markets partly because of its unique packaging. So they came up with this clever idea of putting every consumer goods that they produce, so everything from detergents to deodorants to food seasonings, in very small sachets, as you can see here in this image, which you can purchase individually or as a roll. And it's very popular, especially amongst low-income families, which means that they can purchase more frequently because they tend to be paid weekly or daily instead of monthly, and it means that they become brand loyals because they are this they are the kind of global brands that they can sort of associate with and are able to afford with their limited income. The other example on the right is quite a unique story. So this is Haier's washing machine that also wash potatoes. So the story behind that is that Haier actually had to come to one of these villages in India. So this village doesn't have a washing machine for every household. They have a washing machine for every village. And the engineer found that this washing machine was actually pretty clogged in the pipe. So there's quite a lot of dirt stuck in the pipe. And they were asking the villagers, what have you been using this washing machine for? And the villagers said, we are farmers. We're potato farmers. And instead of washing our produce one by one, we basically just put all the potatoes in the washing machine and they'll come out clean, and it's just easier to clean them that way. So this is a really interesting story, and instead of telling these farmers, no, you can't wash your potatoes in a washing machine, they simply enlarge the pipes, which means that more dirt can come through. And as a result of that, the farmers were happy, and the company were able to sort of tap into this opportunity, realizing that other villages are doing the same. And so they marketed their basic washing machines as basically a multifunctioning washing machine. And more recently, they also advertised another function, which is smoothie making. So instead of making, smoothies by glass, you can chuck in, quite a lot of fruits and water. You put it on spin, and you'll have smoothies for everyone. So I think that's another really great example of flexibility of use for targeting consumers in emerging markets. So another question for you to think about to help you apply the theory that we talked about into practice. Can you think of a brand that successfully offers affordability and accessibility? Well, for me, immediately the brands that come to mind are the German supermarket brands, Aldi and Lidl. So here in the UK, they're very much known for offering, products which are very similar to the most popular brands, but they tend to be a lot cheaper in pricing. These brands also tend to be quite accessible. So the supermarkets locations tend to be located in neighboring areas instead of very far away sort of areas, which means that every neighborhood have an Aldi or Lidl within perhaps 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers from their homes. So it is both affordable and accessible type of strategies that a lot of people can enjoy. Perhaps you can think of other examples of another brand that are affordable and accessible in your life. So that brings us to the end of the taster session. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that you've learned a thing or two. And if you have any question about our marketing department, the degree schemes that we offer, or simply have a question about emerging markets, please do get in touch. This is my email address, and I would be very happy to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening. Bye now.